Hello everyone and welcome to this latest webinar from the European Social Survey, NatSen and City St George's. My name's Eric Harrison, I'm Deputy Director of the ESS. Today we have two colleagues from the Office for National Statistics, Michalina Siemiatkowska and Stephen Gilliland. I'll hand over to them in a second, but just to say that they will speak for around 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. If you'd like to leave a question for the speakers throughout the talk, please use the Q&A function, which is on the top bar of your Teams interface. And we'll take questions after the talk. So without further ado, I hand over to our colleagues from ONS. You have the floor.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here today. So my name is Michalina, and I'm here with my colleague Stephen to talk about how we've implemented knock-to-nudge data collection alongside an adaptive survey design for the transformed labour force survey. So we just wanted to start off with quick introductions, as Stephen and I work in different areas at the ONS. So I am a senior social researcher working in the survey and the sample design team within the social survey transformation division. And our division is currently working on transforming the labour force survey as an online first multi-mode survey. And my team specifically works on the development of the survey and the sample design.
And I'm Stephen Gilliland. I'm the Head of Operational Resource and Survey Strategy for Social Survey Collection Division. So it's my job to help us deliver what we have to deliver on the TLFS and the field operation.
In today's presentation, I will cover a brief introduction into the Transformed Labour Force Survey. I will talk about what an adaptive survey design is and how we have implemented it. I will then hand over to Stephen to talk about knock-to-nudge and how it works on the TLFS. Then I'll talk through the evaluation of the adaptive survey design and knock-to-nudge, which will include the work we did on the knock-to-nudge optimization. And finally, I'll pass back to Stephen to talk through the impact of this work and the next steps. So firstly, I'll start with the Transformed Labour Force Survey. So what is the TLFS? Essentially, it's a transformation of the original labour force survey, which provides the official measures of employment and unemployment in the UK, and it's actually the largest household study in the UK. So we started working on this back in 2017, and the focus of the work has been on redesigning the survey for online data collection. So the underlying principles of the transformation are that the survey should be digital by default. So the focus is on getting the majority of respondents to respond online. And the survey has been statistically redesigned. And by this, we mean that we do not lift and shift the design questions or materials from the existing labour force survey. Instead, everything has been redesigned based on the user needs using respondent-centered design, which focuses on putting the respondent back at the heart of the design. So questions go through extensive rounds of cognitive testing, and the result is that they are usually shorter, simpler, and designed for self-completion. So very briefly, the key aspects of the TLFS design are that the survey is designed to measure core labour market concepts. It has an issued sample size of 140,000 addresses per quarter. We only sample private households, so we exclude communal establishments. The sample is drawn using systematic random sampling. The survey has a longitudinal element whereby a proportion of wave 1 addresses are invited back to participate in 4 more waves at regular quarterly intervals, and this is a mixed mode survey. So respondents are invited and encouraged to take part online first, but there's also the option to participate by telephone. So in 2022, the TLFS response rate was around 35%, which was a good start. But despite the respondent-centered redesign, we were still experiencing differential non-response bias. So our responding sample was biased towards white male homeowners aged 45 plus. And we had an unequal response distribution across region, index of multiple deprivation, and output area classification. So after the pandemic, the natural next step was to introduce face-to-face data collection but with a large-scale survey like the TLFS, we wanted to increase the quality of the data collection, but also keep the costs down. So we explored innovative mixed-mode designs and came across something called an adaptive survey design and knock-to-nudge. So knock-to-nudge involves field interviewers visiting households on the doorstep and encouraging respondents to respond via a remote method, so either online or telephone at a later date. And the benefits of this are that it's less intrusive, less expensive, and interviewers can leave a call today card for non-contacts, which is like a sorry you missed you card, informing the potential respondent on how to take part in the survey. And an adaptive survey design is a data-driven tailoring of data collection procedures to different sample members, often for cost and bias reduction. So it involves dividing your sample into smaller groups or strata that have similar characteristics. So you can split your sample based on age or ethnicity, and then you could apply different design features to different groups. So you can have different incentives or different materials, and the objective is to improve targeted survey outcomes. And I'll now talk about how we've implemented the adaptive survey design for the TLFS. So firstly, why use an adaptive survey design? Well, as mentioned, the TLFS data collection strategy was the same for all sampled addresses. And despite redesigning the survey and implementing online and telephone modes, we were still experiencing differential non-response bias. So it was clear that one strategy wasn't working for all respondents. Online was working well for certain groups, but we knew we needed to introduce face-to-face data collection for others. However, we also knew we didn't have the budget to introduce this mode to all respondents. So an adaptive survey design seemed like a good option, as it allows you to target the right respondents in the right way, rather than targeting all respondents in the same way. And this also results in a more efficient use of the field resources. So we introduced the adaptive survey design in November 2022. Our ASD strategy is heavily informed by the work of Statistics Netherlands. We chose to follow a structured trial-and-error approach using R indicators. So they outline 3 key steps to developing an adaptive survey design. So the first step is to identify auxiliary data to create sample strata. Step 2 is to identify design features to allocate to the strata. And the final step is to identify quality and cost indicators to support decisions. And I'll now talk through how we've implemented each step in a bit more detail. Firstly, we applied a logistic regression model to historical TLFS data to identify auxiliary variables associated with response in order to formulate the ASD strata. And the variables we considered were the index of multiple deprivation, urban and rural classification, country of birth, age, and ethnicity. We then derived and examined several indicators to identify the variables and the categories of variables driving variation in response propensities. And what we found was that the strongest predictors of response were age, urban and rural classification, and the index of multiple deprivation. So we then constructed 8 strata based on these variables that were attached to a sampling frame, which you can see on this slide. And we ran some simulations to assess the effect of improving response across these strata. And the simulations showed we could reduce the CV and improve the R indicator by focusing our efforts on strata 2 to 5. So that's those in the more urban, more deprived, and younger areas. In step 2, we needed to identify design features to allocate to the strata, and there is a potential to include numerous interventions in the ASD, so you can have different modes, different incentives, different materials. However, we decided to keep it simple and have one intervention, which is the knock-to-nudge follow-up. So specifically, our ASD targets knock-to-nudge data collection at underrepresented strata based on response propensities in order to reduce the variation in response propensities for a selected set of auxiliary variables. So this ensures that our data collection resources are used in the most efficient way, whilst increasing response from historically underrepresented population groups. And finally, we needed to think about how we would monitor and evaluate the success of the adaptive survey design. And it is well established in the survey literature that response rates as single indicators provide insufficient information about the quality of estimates. So there is a need for indicators that complement the response rate and measure the contrast between respondents and non-respondents. So we decided to assess a number of quality indicators, including response rates, but also R indicators, coefficient of variation, and the sample composition. And I'll talk about the findings from this later on in the presentation. But just to summarise, our TLFS adaptive survey design was introduced in November 2022, and it is only targeted at non-respondents most likely to reduce bias. So Knock to Nudge is targeted at hard to reach areas only, so those in the more urban, more deprived and younger areas. And finally, we monitor response rates, CVs, R indicators, and the responding sample composition to evaluate the effectiveness of this design.
Thanks, Michalina. I'll now move on to give a little bit more information around what our Knock to Nudge implementation looks like in our field operation. So we originally introduced a Knock to Nudge approach during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we weren't able to conduct in-home interviewing, and we needed to communicate with respondents and try and nudge them to complete our surveys. We then decided to introduce Knock to Nudge in November 22 for our Wave 1 TLFS, and then on the introduction of Wave 2 TLFS in April 2023, we continued to use the Knock to Nudge process for that one too. So what does a Knock to Nudge actually look like? So the interviewer will arrive at the address, and they'll use a lone worker device to explain that they've arrived at the address. They'll start their case on the allocation work. They'll knock on the door. If contact is made, they'll record whatever outcome it was that they've got on the doorstep. If there's no contact made, then they would leave a call to decard. We'll go into what that calling pattern looks like a little bit later, but on a really basic level, that's what a knock to nudge knock would look like for a field interview. And what was the doorstep purpose? So as Michalina had said, it's a digital first survey. So the intention from every knock is to encourage that respondent to complete digitally in the first instance. What we do always aim to do on the doorstep is to secure a telephone number, even if the respondent is intended to complete online. Now, the reason for that is we can then use that telephone number to use another implementation, which would be our telephone unit. So we can call them from our telephone unit to nudge along to complete the survey, and potentially complete the survey over the phone rather than online if they're struggling to complete online. If there's no contact, when we go to the doorstep, we always leave a call to decard with the website, their code to complete the survey online, and the date that we would give them to complete the survey. And then a rough kind of collection timeline would be here for a Wave 1 and a Wave 2. So what you'll see with Wave 1 work, the actual survey period is 4 weeks long. Our Knock to Nudge process doesn't start until week 3. So by the time we go and knock at a door, the respondent has already had 2 weeks to complete the survey online. They receive a letter on day 1, which gives them the opportunity to complete that online. Our job on week 3 is to go out to non-respondents and knock to nudge them to complete. Wave 2 is slightly different in that the collection period is the same as the Knock to Nudge period. So as soon as the survey is open and ready to be completed, we can knock and nudge at that point, and the collection period is much shorter. So I'll look at each of these collection periods in a little bit more depth. So for Wave 1, at the start, they will receive a pre-note which tells them that they are selected to complete the survey. On the start of the period, when the online data collection starts, they'll receive an invitation letter with the UAC enabling them to log on and complete that survey. At the end of the second week, we will send them a reminder letter reminding them that they have until the end of the knock to nudge period to complete the survey. And then on the Monday of week 3, our knock to nudge would begin. They can still complete online during that time, and again, our initial thoughts would be to try and get them to complete that online, and telephone collection would continue during that time as well. In week 4 on the Wednesday, our knock to nudge data collection would stop. However, the online survey would remain open until the Sunday, so they could still continue to complete if they wished. And then wave 2. Wave 2, as I said, is much shorter. So the pre-note sent before we start collecting, and households are reminded by letter that it's time for the next wave of the study. This is a relatively small subsample of non-responding households from wave 1. And our online and telephone collection begins on the same day as our knock to nudge and field begins. And again, they receive that invitation letter with the UAC at that point. Our knock to nudge data collection would stop on the Friday, and the online survey would close a few days later as per wave 1. And then just a little bit more on the mailing strategy here. So each household would receive a pre-note, which tells them that they are sampled to take part in the survey. They will then receive an invite, which would invite them to take part in the survey and would have a deadline date on it. Those deadline dates will be different depending on what time and what wave we are completing the survey in. And then we will send a reminder, at least one reminder, through the post for them to complete the survey. In particularly poor performing cohorts in the middle, we sometimes make a decision to send an additional reminder letter, and that's because when we send a reminder letter, we do see a slight peak in response. So it does encourage respondents to take part. And then the allocation of work. So our TLFS allocation is released to managers on the Thursday when the knock to nudge starts on the Monday. We introduced a new allocation process for us to allocate that, which was done through an auto allocation system. One of the differences between TLFS and all of our other surveys is that it's an unclustered sample, and it's also a sample that we can't see ahead of time. So the first visibility we have of the cases that we are going to allocate happens on the Thursday when they arrive live in the system. And because it's an unclustered sample, these are individual addresses that might not be clustered into a route that can be worked easily by the field interviewer. That work is then dispatched out on a Sunday evening to the interviewer, ready to start knock to nudge on the Monday. And there is then a 10-day field period where we would be out knocking and nudging, and those overlap with the following weeks. So interviewers, if they were working on TLFS every week, would always have 2 cohorts of wave 1 that we're working on at one time. And then this is just another view of that allocation process. So the work is released on the 4th, on the 4th day, which is the Thursday, dispatched on the Sunday night, and then there's 10 days for the interviewers to complete their knock and nudge. So when we introduced this, there was lots of initial challenges in field. So I'll just run through some of those challenges just now, and we can run through what we did to address those. So one of the first challenges that we found in field was to do with the unclustered sample. So flexibility of the survey we found pretty tough. We pushed out all of the cases that were expected to be worked in field, which meant there was significant effort for single cases that were in remote locations, which we found tough. So there would be individual addresses that were maybe three hours away, and the interview would have to travel all the way there to do a knock and all the way back, because we're working the whole sample. We had some visibility issues, so we had limited MI with it being a new survey, and we also had a new allocation system that our interview managers had to learn and understand, and it was sometimes difficult for us to see exactly what was happening on the ground. We had some consistency issues around number of visits, and some of the doorstep info we were given to respondents. Again, that was down to us having a new survey and trying to understand exactly what that wave of contact looked like. We had significant problems with compatibility with other field work. we worked several other social surveys that are completely different to TLFS, and we found it quite difficult to blend those workloads alongside each other. We had lots of sampled addresses in different areas, and trying to work the unclustered work around that we were finding quite tough. Trying to balance the calling patterns between TLFS and the other ones we were finding tough as well, and all the work was in different areas, which was also a challenge. Given the way that we designed the sample for TLFS, and with the majority of the sample being in what we would classify as hard to reach, we found contact difficult. That's because the strata that we're targeting were much more likely to be in places where it was difficult for us to gain contact. So there might be concierge, there might be multiple dwelling units, lots of different challenges that were more prevalent in this sample than in one of our other samples. And the other kind of main challenge that we found was the parallel run. So we are currently and still collecting data on LFS at the same time as we're collecting data on the transformed labour force survey, and that's been a real challenge on the ground with resource.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll now talk about the evaluation we conducted to assess the effectiveness of the design. And as mentioned earlier, as part of this evaluation, we assess a number of quality indicators, and I'll now talk through each one of these in more detail. So firstly, I'll start with response rates, and here you can see the cumulative response rate across January to December across our 4-week data collection period. So like Stephen mentioned, if no response is received after 2 weeks, that's when knock to nudge begins. So before day 14, you can see that there's a big gap between the non-filled response, which is the grey line, and the filled response, which is the orange line. However, after day 14, this gap starts to close, and by day 28, filled and non-filled response are a lot closer together. So this shows that knock to nudge activity significantly improves the response rate for those identified as hard to reach and reduces the variation in response between the two groups. We also looked at the response rate by the ASD strata, and here you can see that the response rate increase from weeks 3 and 4 is greater among the strata that receive knock to nudge visits. So in other words, response increased by around 7 to 8 percentage points for those in strata 1 and strata 6 to 8, so those that don't get knock to nudge visits, whereas response increased by around 10 to 12 percentage points for those in strata 2 to 5, so those that do receive knock to nudge. And of course, an increase in response is great, but we also want to know if this actually translates into better quality data. And to measure this, we use something called R indicators. And R indicators essentially measure the extent to which a survey is representative of a population. And in order to see an improvement in the data, you want to see an increase in the R indicator, which you can see here. So this suggests that our data is getting more representative as a result of our design. Another thing we use is something called coefficient of variation, or CV, and it's the variation in response propensities for a selected set of auxiliary variables. So for this, in order to see an improvement, you want to see a decrease in the CV, which again, you can see on the slide, and this is suggesting an improvement in response variation. Finally, we've also examined the sample composition, so comparing the TLFS sample before and after the ASD has been introduced to see whether the adaptive survey design leads to an increase in the sample for certain groups. And here are just a couple of examples. So this is showing that post-ASD, under 45s, ethnic minority groups, and those in the more deprived areas were a larger proportion of the TLFS sample. So we reflected on these findings from the evaluation, and although we were pleased with the positive improvements, we were surprised the impact hadn't been larger. And our original plan was to work on the next iteration of the adaptive survey design, but it occurred to us that one of the elements we hadn't looked at was how well the knock to nudge operation was working on the ground. So we carried out some initial analysis of the knock to nudge data, and it highlighted several operational challenges, some of which Stephen mentioned earlier. So for example, there were instances where interviewers were not adhering to knock to nudge guidelines. We weren't meeting all of our targets because we weren't reaching enough addresses. We noticed some regional differences in the cases that we were and weren't visiting. Some qualitative feedback revealed limited tools to monitor staff performance, both for our teams, but also for the field managers. Also, from our side, we initially underestimated that this was a new way of operating for the interviewers, so it was a culture change. Interviewers were no longer doing in-home interviewing for the TLFS. They were now only nudging cases and only going to the hard-to-reach addresses. So the role became less about interviewing and more about a greater ability to persuade, quickly build trust, and overcome objections on the doorstep. So that meant that the role became quite difficult and not as rewarding and motivating. So these insights really highlighted the importance of bringing together our statistical design team with the field operations to help tackle some of those challenges. And we also worked alongside the management information team at the ONS to develop some MI as part of this optimization work. So one of the things we've reviewed was the call-in pattern. So our original ask for the TLFS was that the interviewers do a minimum of 3 visits and a maximum of 6 visits per household. However, as you can see from these 2 graphs, what we found was that response and contact is most likely for visit 1 in particular, but also visit 2 and 3, and that with more visits, the impact of those on response and contact drops. So we felt that this was really strong evidence to suggest that doing more than 3 visits is not an efficient use of the interviewer's time. And as a result, we updated the guidance to have a maximum of 3 visits per household instead of 6. We also reviewed whether there's a best day of the week or time of the day to visit to make contact. However, we didn't find any major differences. So we asked the interviewers to spread out those 3 visits across 3 different days and 3 different time slots. So morning, afternoon, and evening, to give us the best chance to reach a household. It was also really important for us to develop some management information to be able to monitor interviewers' performance, and RMI colleagues have created some really insightful and user-friendly dashboards using Power BI. I've just included one example here, which specifically focuses on call-in pattern adherence. So this essentially allows us to see whether the interviewers are following that call-in checklist I've just mentioned, and if they aren't, we can see what the reasons are. And we can filter this view to show any combinations of interviewers and months. And these dashboards are updated every day, which allow us to track things essentially in real time and look at trends over time. So they provide clear visibility into individual performance, ensuring transparency and accountability across teams. And as a result of updating the call-in pattern and reducing the number of visits, we were able to reach a larger number of addresses. So here you can see the comparison in the cases or addresses visited between 2023 and 2024. And you can see that last year we visited significantly more addresses across all the months. And it's also great to see that our interviewers really embrace the changes we've implemented as part of this work and really help to improve the operation. We are also meeting or getting very close to our national targets, which are target numbers for how many addresses should receive an knock-to-nudge visit. So for wave 1, this is 3,160 addresses per cohort, and for wave 2, this is 695 addresses per cohort. And as mentioned earlier, we weren't reaching these numbers before, so this is another big improvement. And we also developed regional targets by splitting our national targets proportionally across the regions. And these allow us to monitor for any regional differences, as we don't want obviously one area to be doing really well and another one to be doing really bad, as this can introduce bias. So again, this is something that we are now able to monitor.
So I'll just start looking at what our next steps are, and also look at what the impact of some of this knock-to-nudge optimization work that we did. So from a field perspective, here's some of the other areas that we focused on as part of the knock-to-nudge optimization. So on the flexibility side, we started pushing out significantly more priority cases and working a set amount of them. This allowed us a little bit more flexibility with what cases we could work alongside our other work, and allow us to cluster the work more effectively. Around the visibility side, we'd seen some of the dashboards and some of the MI that we had pulled together to support. We also had some other MI on things like cases not worked, and on percentage of cases that result in success. Our initial feedback from the interviewer team was that because they were going out and knocking on lots of doors to get people to take part, they didn't know whether that person had actually taken part or not. So we created dashboards that allowed them to track whether what their overall response was at the end of the cohort that their interview managers could take them through. Around consistency, we made some changes to the way that we processed refusals, and we found that outright refusals were really high, and did some work around that to try and get more things kept in as circumstantial, which then allowed us to keep more cases in throughout the waves and not lose as many addresses. We also clarified the TLFS collection journey, and clarified when letters would land at what time and what deadlines would be on them, to ensure that the interviewer had all the information they needed on the doorstep to arm the respondent. And another bit of work that we did was around the compatibility. So Michalina taking you through, the reduced call numbers really helped us to fit this work in alongside other work. And what we also had to do pretty quickly was recruit. So we did lots of recruitment to allow us to have new interviewers come in to take some of the TLFS work to help us reduce some of the burden on our existing interviewers. And what was the impact of all this then? So the knock-to-nudge target numbers have been exceeded very well since we did all this work, which has been excellent. Our call and pattern adherence for TLFS is significantly better than it is on our other surveys. And some of that is down to the communication work that we did around that time and in the simplification of it. So reducing it down to just 3 visits at different times has really helped us to make sure that we reduce bias, but also that we give them a call and pattern that they can hit. We also introduced TLFS specific interviewer managers for a period of time. Again, this was to support us to make sure that we could deliver what we had to on TLFS, and also allowed us to reduce some of the burden on the interviewer team, who, when working TLFS, if it was just TLFS they were working, is a completely different type of job from what they were used to. You've seen the kind of sheer volume of cases that we were working, doing that and just going to hard to count all the time was really tough, and the guys struggled with that initially. And that's the kind of interviewer morale piece. Interviewer morale was much better because we were able to blend some of that work a little bit better and take some of it away, because the initial feedback from the interviewer team was that they were finding it tough to go door to door with no interview break in between. It's also allowed us to have more regional specific focus for performance. So that these conversations that we've been having with research and SST have allowed us to identify particular regions where we're maybe a little bit short on addresses, which then allows us to go and impact that in field and provide more addresses going forward before we've got a data quality issue. And what are our next steps then? So our next steps are to continue to promote this work. So publications and conferences, and make sure that we continue to talk about the successes that we've found with both the ASD and with our knock-to-nudge optimization. We have found some training needs that need to happen for the teams on the ground, which we're going to start on now. We want to continue working collaboratively across research, SST and operations, and hopefully continue to do that across all of our surveys, because we've found that probably the most valuable part of what we've done. We want to continue to analyse this data, monitor the MI, and address any issues we can quickly. I think the next step for that for us is we want to be in a position that we can proactively impact our delivery in regions and in local authorities with that responsive design in week and in month. So rather than dealing with an issue when when it happens, be in a position that we can change the way that we're allocating that resource in week and in month to help us to deliver more. And we also are planning to return to a blended workloads for allocation. So moving all the TLFS out and having it covered by individual teams was really useful for a period of time. But in order for our allocations to be effective, we need to be blending all that work in together and working it based on location. So the plan working forward is to move back to that model. Yeah, and I think that's everything from me and Michalina. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of work behind that, wasn't there? Fascinating talk. So we have some questions already in Q&A. So let's kick off. Jamie asked, how were interviewers remunerated for the Not to Nudge work?
The same way as they would be remunerated for any other piece of work that we would take on. Guys are paid a salary in the same way. Wasn't any additional remuneration for Not to Nudge.
Yeah, I presume that was a question about patterns. In other words, was it sort of piecework, but you've covered that as a sort of salaried approach. Okay, Chris Martin asks, did you look at calling patterns against the characteristics of respondents? So, for instance, were you more likely to recruit underrepresented groups at particular times of the day or on a day of the week?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not yet. I think that is a really interesting thing to look at. I think from when we were looking at the calling patterns originally, although it's improved, I think we still want the interviewers to be hitting the 3 visits at 3 different times, 3 different days, so we can really see the impact of it. Because sometimes we've seen, and it only happens, I think, a couple of times, but sometimes an interviewer will do a visit, but then input that into the app later on. So sometimes it's quite actually difficult to see. Like, we've seen a couple of visits that are happening at midnight that we know aren't actually happening at midnight. So I think I think it's more the use of the app, perhaps, maybe, but once we get that, we might be able to look at, if there's like a particular day or particular time of the day where it's really good to get a certain group of people.
I think just to build on that, we rely on the expertise of the field community to make a decision on that. So a lot of our interviewers have worked in the same areas for 20 years. They know when they can get in touch with respondents and at what part of the day in whatever particular area it is that they're in. So we do need to allow their expertise to kind of dictate what that needs to look like in particular regions.
Okay, thanks. Sam's asking, how effective is any of the telephone follow-up you do based on the phone numbers collected on the doorstep that you mentioned?
It's pretty effective. I think we did do telematching for a period that was probably less effective. But the telephone follow-up we do based on the phone numbers that we collect we don't have quite as good a response rate from that as we do from the online only. But we do get a fair amount of response based on that.
Okay, thank you. Jerry Nicholas asks, it's clarification, I think. Assume the pre-note without the URL is sent before the data collection starts to allow the 3 mailings to be sent without having to increase the data collection period unduly. If so, do you have any evidence that this pre-note letter without the URL increases the response rate before the nudging starts as compared to not having a pre-note sent out? That's a bit detailed, but you get the gist.
We asked lots of questions about our mailing plan when we were doing design work on TLFS, because there's lots of kind of strange things that happen within the design. So we give about 3 or 4 different deadlines on these letters. It's like a kind of phased approach. So that first letter that we give them out to complete has the deadline before the Not to Nudge period. So by the time we go to Not to Nudge, the respondent already thinks that the survey is closed off. And there's lots of different research that went in each stage. In terms of the pre-note and the effectiveness of the pre-note, I'd probably need to take that away to get an answer and then can come back. But our email addresses are there, so if you want to drop an email on Jenny, I'll pick that up and get an answer back to you.
Super, thanks for that promise. Question from Tim Hansen. Did you recruit any specific resource to only deliver the knock to nudge and not to do any actual interviewing? So you used the term interviewers throughout the talk, or is there always a combination of people of doing knock to nudge and some actual interviewing in the field?
So I think in order for us to be as effective as we can be as a field operation, it needs to be that second part where there's a combination of knock to nudge and interviewing. In the interim, for the last year or so since we've been doing this design, we have moved to having recruiting resource that is just doing that TLFS work and just knocking to nudge. That's worked really well, and I imagine some of those people that have come in to just do that would probably find the idea of working a blended dashboard not as attractive as that. But it is a completely different type of role. It's really different demands. You've seen the actual volume of cases for TLFS is significantly higher than what these guys would normally work on, and you are going to addresses where we are more unlikely to gain contact than what we are in our other sampled surveys. But we have had lots of success with that specific resource to just deliver that knock to nudge. But I think in order for that allocation to be effective, it has to be that second part. We need to be in a position that we've got interviewers doing a combination of the knock to nudge work and the interviewing that's local to their area.
Yeah, that's interesting. They're sort of quite different sets of skills, aren't they? Question from Ed. What are the knock to nudge interviewers doing with those who can't complete online? Are they arranging a telephone or a face-to-face visit?
We would arrange a telephone follow up from our telephone unit. So they would process that on our management system on the doorstep, and from the next day, telephone unit would start to call them in 3 different time slots until we got through to them to complete that. There is not currently a face-to-face option on TLFS.
Okay, thank you. Little cluster of 3 questions from Michalina. Firstly, did you examine the effectiveness of knock to nudge for Kawi-Kati response in comparison with using a traditional CAPI mode after the Kawi-Kati, if you see what I mean? In other words,
yeah, that's what I think.
I'm assuming this is just looking at the effectiveness of knock to nudge for sort of the web response compared to the traditional sort of face-to-face mode. It's quite hard to compare to other surveys that we do, because for knock to nudge we are only going to hard to reach addresses, so the impact of knock to nudge might look smaller, but it's the people that we really want to get and that are underrepresented in the sample compared to, for example, the traditional LFS, which is only face-to-face but goes out to everyone. So that's like the best comparison that we can do, I think.
Okay, follow-up to that. So how would you recommend using knock to nudge in a sequential mixed mode setting? So maybe it's Kawi, Kati and CAPI. For instance, how to avoid respondents using knock to nudge as an excuse and then ultimately not responding.
That's still you, Michalina?
Yeah. Let me just reread the question. I mean, I think, so the way obviously we did it was as like a last option. So only go into the hard to reach addresses and only nudging them, and sort of training the interviewers on that refusal approach. So yeah, people don't just tell them, oh yeah, I'll complete online, and then sort of never do. But I think it just depends on the survey, and this is our first iteration at the moment, so yeah, that's as much as I can say.
Yeah, okay. Another sort of forward-looking one from Gilliland. Do you see knock to nudge as becoming an essential part of online surveys, or do you think this need is specific to your LFS situation?
I think from our perspective, I think Knock to Nudge has been invaluable and has been able to encourage respondents to complete the survey. I think particularly in areas that we're operating in, it's people that would not respond without that interaction. So I think, yeah, I think it probably is an essential part of any online survey. I think we missed one from Frank as well. I'll just pick up just now. So interviewers changed role. Did you experience impact on interviewer attrition? Do you adjust recruitment and interviewer nudge or training protocols? So had we not done the Knock to Nudge optimization, I think we probably would have experienced larger interviewer attrition. In terms of how we adjust recruitment and interviewer nudge or training protocols, when we're bringing in interviewers that are just going to be doing Knock to Nudge, that training and kit setup is much shorter, so we can get people in quicker and have them mobilised much more effectively, because we don't have to train them on quite as much as we had to if they were going out and doing a traditional survey and asking questions in home.
Okay, I think, does that maybe answer Sierra's question as well, which is related about interviewer morale? So was there a difference in morale between more experienced interviewers for whom this was a new thing and newer ones?
So the morale dip is probably less of a morale dip and more just of an impression of the role that we were asking them to do. I think because of the volume of TLFS is so large in comparison to our surveys, you know, the lion's share of the work that we were asking experienced interviewers to do was knocking and nudging in really difficult areas. And that's a massive sea change from what these guys would ordinarily do. Ordinarily, they could be, you know, spending a few hours doing some financial surveys, a few hours doing some LFS work, and asking lots of questions to the public and engaging with the public. And I think that change to just being told no more often than they're used to was really tough. So I think trying to shift to break that down and try and give them less of that work and try and give as much variety as we can has been the bit that's helped us with morale. What I would say is the guys that we're bringing in just to do the Knock to Nudge, we don't see that same problem. The guys are quite happy with the role.
Thank you. Abigail's a question: what were the incentives used for respondents? I presume that means respondent incentives rather than respondent related incentives for interviewers.
When you go, Michalina.
I was just going to say, so for completion, there is at the moment, I think there's a £10 incentive voucher for the whole household, but I know there were trials going on testing different amounts. Sorry, I can't see the question, but yeah, you go, Stephen, as well, if you wanted to come in.
Yeah, we did do a little bit of a trial and some physical incentives as well, so tote bags, things like that, alongside the unconditional incentive.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, could I just come in there? We can provide details on the incentives trials that we've done in the past, and as Stephen said, we've done some physical incentives as well, like a tote bag and a notepad, and these are actually really highly effective. The tote bag was one of the most successful, but it's the practicalities of packing and dispatching that to a sample of 140,000, which, although it got the best response rate, it wasn't the most practical. So we've actually gone back to doing a £10 for the household now, and I think the notepads are still being used as well, but we can provide more details to Abigail if you want.
Thank you. One for, I think it's more of a comment from Juhani, saying they've also experimented with ASD in the Finnish labour force survey using model-based approach, attempting to predict the expected interviewer effort involved in establishing contact, and then using that to assign contact priorities. So more use of sort of predictive models. Barry Shouten asks, is TLFS still a household survey, or does it have any household component? If so, how does that work in Knock to Nudge? in terms of making contact and collecting contact details?
So we go out to private households at the moment only. So it is a household study still. We don't do like communal establishments or anything like that.
So I presume that the question is it a survey of individuals, or it says household component?
Oh yes,
might
sorry,
you be
yeah.
collecting
So
numerous?
yeah, so we send it out to a household, but we want all the people within the household to respond. So it's not yeah, it's the whole household rather than like an individual within a household, yeah. But the knock to nudge element is at a house, so it's targeted at household level. So the three variables that I mentioned, where it's targeted the urban and rural, age, and IMD, they're at LSOA level. The variables are at LSOA level. So we're targeting the areas that we think are hard to reach, less likely to respond.
Super. Question from Rick. You mentioned that you've got unclustered samples and sometimes single cases in remote locations. How do you deal with those to keep, for instance, travel times limited?
Yeah, that's where it's important that we try and blend our work as much as possible, because there will likely be other work in a similar area that we can tag on alongside it. Whereas if we just work the survey in isolation, it would be really difficult for you to complete those types of cases cost effectively.
Thank you. Interesting one from Robert. Looking at regional response rates, do you think these were more due to fieldwork ethic, in other words, on the interviewer side, or population-specific cultural differences in trust, i.e. on the respondent side?
I would say a combination of all of those things. I think it's really difficult looking at regional response rates and that not coming down to behaviours in some way, shape or form, different things like that. And then things like London, contact in London is extremely difficult. So it just depends really. But I think a combination of all of those things.
Yeah. There's a question from Rana. I think you've already dealt with this. How did you handle the challenge of knock to nudge in the unclustered design with a lot of efforts needed? I think you've addressed this in the blended.
Yes, so the way that we handled that in the main is that we requested more cases to be pushed to field, so we don't work them all, but it allows us to cluster the work more effectively. Whereas if we just have 3,000 cases and we have to work every single one, we don't have any control over the locations that we're working. If we push out 4,000 and I work 3,000 of those, we have a little bit more flexibility around what we work and what we leave.
Bjorn Janssen, can you say something about the percentage of sample units that were nudged to respond online that did actually follow up on the commitment? And do interviewers go back after some time if the sample unit doesn't actually respond? I think you've.
Yeah, they do. So
Yeah.
if we go on a first contact, the person tells us they're going to complete online, that case will stay live in the interviewer's management case management file, and they can go back to that address at the end of that period to say, oh, still not completed. As soon as that's completed, they complete online, it would drop off of the total mobile.
Okay. Steve asks, I might have missed this, but what percentage of knock to nudge cases result in contact being made? Also, what percentage of knock to nudge contacts result in a web or telephone complete?
Okay, so the knock to nudge contact is around 60 to 70%. It moves in and around. It's slightly lower than what we would expect on a standard sample, but it's around 60 to 70%. In terms of what percentage of knock to nudge contacts result in a web or telephone complete, I think the last time I checked it was around 16 or 17%, something like that.
Good, thank you. Follow up from Barry. Non-response may be due to digital illiteracy or language, but there may be other reasons that knock to nudge is not fully effective. To increase interviewer morale and efficacy, perhaps collect doorstep paradata and or keep a knock to interview as an additional option, question mark.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Okay. And the last one on the in the window at the moment from Jamie. Do interviewers collect phone numbers for everyone over the age of 16 in the household, or just the informant? And can this lead to bias if knock to nudge is only effective for the informant and not the whole household?
They would only collect a phone number for the person that we're speaking to on the doorstep. They wouldn't collect it for the whole house.
Okay. Again, small clarification question. This one's from Daniel. I may have missed this part, but does remote mode mean sending a video interview link to respondent or leaving a tablet for a respondent?
We wouldn't be involved in any way, shape, or form in them completing the survey. So we would nudge to get them to go and complete it, and they would complete it in their own time on their own devices.
Yeah. By remote, we just mean like mostly online or telephone.
Yeah. Okay. We've come to the end of the questions in the window, which will be a relief to you. You've done a sterling job in fielding all of those. Can I just finish by asking you to talk a little bit about the quality indicators? It's just a speculative question, really. So in one of your very early slides, you talked about 4 different types: response rate, R indicators, CV, and sample composition. You said a little bit about those as you went forward. I wondered if you'd sort of given any thought about sort of strategically what weight you gave respectively to those 4. I mean, obviously we always say we're interested in doing as well as we can on every measure, but do you have a sense of internally of how you weigh the value of those?
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, I think there's a lot of talk always about, getting the highest response rates, but I think that's why, so that's the one that gets discussed quite a lot internally, is like get really high response rates. But I think that's why we try and talk about the other ones as much, because just if we can get a really high response rates, but we'll just get the same people responding, and that doesn't really help with our estimates. So I think looking at the sample composition is really important, because then we can actually see if what we set out to do to get those hard to reach groups, if we're actually getting them, or if we're still getting the same types of people. So I think looking at sample composition is quite important, but also just the R indicator and the CV is just another way for us to see if another indicator to see if the ASD is working. So yeah, we're basically just trying to move away from just looking at the response rates and look at other indicators as well to measure the quality.
Super. Well, I think that's a good point at which to leave it. As I say, thank you so much, not only for the talk, but for dealing so efficiently with a bumper crop of questions. I think that shows how engaged and interested your audience has been. We'll be back again soon with more webinars, so please look out on our socials for publicity. But that's it for today, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.